Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Hey everybody, this is Russ, and thanks so much for listening to the Key Chapters podcast. As you probably know, I'm on sabbatical right now, so what we're doing is we're uploading episodes from last year. That means the audio may not be great at times, or maybe even have some glitches here and there. So thank you for your grace and your patience, and I hope this podcast just continues to be a blessing to you in your walk with the Lord. So with that, here we go with today's episode. Today we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel 18 and discuss David's friendship with Jonathan and Saul's hatred of David. Now, you'll remember the context of this passage. 3 days ago, we were looking at 1 Samuel 15, and we saw Saul's disobedience and Samuel's prophecy that the Lord would take the kingdom away from Saul. Then, 2 days ago, we were in 1 Samuel 16, where Samuel anointed David to be the next king. Yesterday, we were in 1 Samuel 17, where Saul was too afraid to take on Goliath, but David did. And today we're now turning to 1 Samuel 17. We're going to see how the Lord just prospers David and just continues to bring up this judgment upon Saul. Now, as we go to this passage here, one of the critical ways that the Lord prospers David is by putting a key person in his court or on his side. Throughout history, many of God's people required someone else to protect them. Martin Luther is a great example of that and how he's protected by Frederick III and just kept him alive so he was able to lead the Reformation. And so David's got this friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son. Jonathan may not have fully understood his role that he was going to play in all of this, but he is instrumental in preserving David's life. And that preservation begins here in chapter 18, specifically in verse 3, where Jonathan makes a covenant with David. Now, by now, we should be fairly familiar with what covenants are. They are formal agreements between two people based on promises that they make to one another. Now, this passage doesn't tell us what kind of covenant they do make together, but I would imagine it was something along the lines of David promising not to usurp Saul's authority and Jonathan promising not to fight against David when the Lord finally does put him on the throne. And it's important to see that David does not ascend the throne while his friend Jonathan is alive. Jonathan is killed in battle over in 1 Samuel 31. David doesn't take the throne until 2 Samuel. And even then, David is gracious to Jonathan's son Mephibosheth because he just wants to maintain his loyalty and his fidelity to his friendship with Jonathan. And so with this covenant here, Jonathan gives David his robe and his sword and his bow and his belt. Now remember, at this point in the history of Israel, the Philistines wouldn't allow the Jewish people to make their own swords. So who has a sword? Well, up till now, it was Saul and his son who was the heir to the throne. Now, it's Saul and David who is the true heir to the throne. And so David's got this sword and he's going on out to battle. And verse 5 tells us that wherever Saul sends David, David prospers in the sight of the people and really in the sight of Saul's servants, really in everybody's sight except for Saul. Verse 6 kind of gives us a reason why things began to change. When David got back from his fight against the Philistine, which is Goliath, the women were singing in verse 7, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And that really makes Saul mad. I mean, he can begin to see the writing on the wall, and he even says at the end of verse 8, now what more can he have but the kingdom? And so we just start to see this radical change in heart. In fact, in verse 10, we're seeing Saul. Remember, Saul is the same guy who had compassion on the king of the Amalekites, who was a direct, clear enemy of God under God's judgment. And he was giving mercy to Agag, and now he is showing violent hostility to David, who is God's chosen servant. You're just seeing how scrambled Saul is at this point, and how his own motives are so directed towards himself, and so clearly not for the Lord's kingdom. Well, the next day, a spirit comes upon Saul, an evil spirit, and David is playing this harp, and Saul just hucks the spirit at him and tries to kill him. He does this twice, and David escapes. And so from that point on, Saul was afraid of David because he could see all of God's blessings upon him and how the Lord was causing David to prosper in all his ways. Now, you would think that this would just bring about repentance in Saul's heart, but it doesn't. It just really galvanizes him to hate David and want to kill David. And so in verse 15, Saul's dread of David just continues to grow, even as the people's love for David continues to grow in verse 16. So in all of this, Saul is just tortured by this. He's not thinking clearly, and he schemes to give his daughter Merab to David as his wife. But David's got this humble view of himself, and he says, who am I to marry the king's daughter? And so Saul gives Merab now to a guy named Adriel. Just kind of a weird little situation there. But as it turns out, Saul's other daughter, Michal, loved David. And so in verse 21, Saul thinks that she might somehow be a snare to him. Maybe he can use Michal and this promise of marriage to really get rid of David. And so he works out with David just this low dowry price of, if you can just pay me with 100 Philistine foreskins, I'll give you my daughter. Saul was expecting the Philistines to take out David, but it doesn't work out that way, and David returns with 200. And so now he's going to be marrying Michal. And so all of this is just further confirmation that David is the rightful heir to the throne, and this just continues to increase Saul's fear of David. So that's the passage. Why is this a key chapter? Well, first of all, if you were to read the next set of chapters, we're going to be reading chapter 24 next, but if you just read between now and then and really just the rest of the book, you're going to see that Saul just hates David. He's constantly trying to kill David, and you might be wondering why. This chapter shows us Saul is about his own kingdom. He's about himself. This power is completely gone to his head. I mean, this is the guy who was afraid to even ascend the throne. Remember, he was hanging out in the baggage, and now he's refusing to give it up, even when it is so obvious that the Lord has forsaken him and put God's blessings upon David. This is a huge contrast to David. As we just continue to learn more about David, we see he's a man constantly about God and his kingdom and God's glory. And we can totally see why there's this difference and why God prospers David and doesn't prosper Saul. This passage also helps us see the principle that if we're doing God's will, even if someone else schemes against us, it will ultimately accomplish God's purposes. You see, Saul was doing all of these things like sending David out to this military outpost, thinking David might be killed. It just proves to just show how God was blessing David and just David's character and his leadership. Likewise, Saul thought, well, maybe I can snare David with Michal. But instead, God blesses that too, or at least in the early days, a relationship might go sour later on. It just depends on how you read those passages later. But at this point, we're seeing that everything that Saul is doing to get back at David or undermine David, the Lord is just turning to being more prosperity for David. And so this is just a principle for us ourselves. The key here is that we need to be doing God's will and obeying Him. Life is difficult, life has pains, life has struggles, but if we have that assurance that we're walking with God, we're obeying Him, we're in His Word, we're seeking to honor and glorify Him, we could have the comfort and the encouragement to know that we do have God's provision, protection, and that whatever we're going through, God can ultimately work this on out for His glory, for the good of those who love Him. Third, as we go through this passage here, we just need to be aware of David's faithfulness to his covenant with Jonathan. David is not trying to overthrow Jonathan, nor is he trying to take anything from Jonathan. As we said, David won't take the throne until Jonathan is finally killed. And so this covenant that we see here is just super important. There's just this incredible friendship, this incredible bond between the two. Now, tragically, Jonathan dies when David is relatively young. He's going to take the throne at 30 years old. He's going to reign for another 40 years. And so for 40 years, he's just remembering this friendship. I can imagine just many times when he's thinking about his life and just the plan and how God has worked out the details, thinking back to this friendship and what it meant to him and how God had used Jonathan to save David's life so many times. David would never have another Jonathan, and he would never forget him. And we just see the power of that friendship starting here in chapter 18. And along those lines, this passage also shows us God's sovereignty over friendships and relationships and how He placed Jonathan in this incredible role to support David, to protect him, and ultimately be a vital part of God's plan for David. And so for a final application today, let's just end by thinking about the relationships in our life. As we just think about who we might know, maybe somebody at work, maybe somebody at church, maybe one of our family members, is there someone that God has called you to support and encourage? If so, just when we end, let's just spend some time with the Lord asking Him for grace and help and wisdom to serve the Lord and that person in whatever they're going through. Likewise, is there anyone doing that for us? We need to remember that, again, David doesn't have another Jonathan the rest of his life, so it's not as though these kinds of relationships are common. And even if we don't have a friendship as close as what Jonathan and David had here, we still see these two men as examples of what it means to have a friend where we can pursue righteous goals together and accomplish God's purposes. And just celebrate those relationships, whether it's a friend, a spouse, a family member, those who we can come alongside of and serve the Lord together. God has blessed David with this incredible friendship of Jonathan. And might we be Jonathans and might we be Davids to the people in our life as well. Well, we'll end things there and we'll catch up with you tomorrow. If you do listen to this in real time, it's going to be an afternoon post, and so we'll just see you then. And otherwise, I hope the rest of your day is great and focused on the Lord. Have a great afternoon or great morning or a great whenever. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.